Happy Wednesday, everyone. Sorry I can't be there, but we are going to go through 1.5 things. So we're going to talk about the discriminant, which is new information, and then we're going to solve quadratics with complex numbers, and we'll talk a little more about that in a second. So let's start with the discriminant. First of all, the discriminant tells you the number and type of solutions that you're going to have. So the discriminant tells you the number and type of solutions you are going to have. Now, the nice thing about the discriminant is it's part of the quadratic formula. So all of the stuff that's underneath the square root is my discriminant. So the b squared minus 4 times a times c is your discriminant. We're going to use this to determine how many solutions we have and the types of solutions that we have. And let's talk about each of the differences. So here's the first option. If you get a positive number when you plug it in here, so if you get a positive number, then there are 2 real solutions. So if you get a positive number, there are 2 real solutions. So this would be all the problems we've done up to this point using the quadratic formula. When you solve, you get 2 answers. Sometimes they're whole numbers or fractions, sometimes there's square roots involved, but there's 2 answers and they're real numbers. Okay, so they're real solutions. Now, we haven't seen this so much, but it could happen. If our answer is 0, so when we plug it all in here, if we get an answer of 0, then there is 1 real solution. Let's talk about why that even happens. So if you got 0 underneath the square root is 0, right? So whatever your number is plus or minus 0 is not going to change anything, which is why you have 1 answer. So for instance, if you were using the quadratic formula and you had like -5 plus or minus and you ended up with the square root of 0, the square root of 0 is 0, and whether you add 0 or subtract 0, your answer is still -5. Okay, that's why we have 1 real solution. Now our last option, which we have not seen yet, which we will see today, is if you get a negative number. So if you get a negative number, there are 2 imaginary solutions. Now, we talked about imaginary solutions at the beginning of the semester, and that's when we had the square root of -1. Does anyone remember what the square root of -1 is? I hope you remember that it's I. So if you take the square root of a negative number, remember your answer is I, which gives you 2 imaginary solutions. Okay. Now, technically, any of the problems that we've been looking at before we either factor or take square roots or use the quadratic formula or complete the square, I could determine beforehand what kind of answers I'm going to get, which would then help me decide how I'm going to solve. Okay, that's an option. So for right now, we're just going to determine the discriminant. So if you're asked to find the discriminant, you're finding the number and type of solutions. Okay, so we're finding the number and type of solutions. So let's just do a couple problems with the discriminant before we move on. So let's look at n squared plus 4n equals 21. In order to even plug anything into this, I have to know what A, B, and C is, which means I have to rewrite this in standard form. In order to write in standard form, I'm going to subtract 21 from both sides, giving me n squared plus 4n minus 21 equals 0. I can now identify A, B, and C. So A is 1, B is 4, C is negative 21. Okay. Again, I'm not using the quadratic formula. I am just looking for the discriminant. Okay, just the discriminant. So we're just plugging it into that piece. So 4 squared minus 4 times A times C. And then we're going to solve that. 4 squared is 16. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 21 is a positive 84. Okay. 16 plus 84 is 100. So my discriminant is 100. Okay, that's the first part of my answer. And then it tells me what I have here. So it's a positive number. So a positive number means there are 2 real solutions. Okay, so I have a positive number, which means I have 2 real solutions. That's all we're doing for discriminant, is just identifying what the discriminant is and how many solutions you get. So let's look at, we're not going to do very many of these. And really we're only doing these to talk about types of solutions that we could possibly get, not so much the discriminant part. Okay, so let's look at 4p squared minus 10p plus 7 equals negative 3. So again, before I can do anything, it has to be in standard form. In order to get it in standard form, I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So 4p squared minus 10p plus 10 equals 0. It's in standard form. In order to plug it in, I have to identify A, B, and C. So A is 4, B is negative 10, C is positive 10. Okay, we're plugging it into the discriminant. So negative 10 squared minus 4 times A times C. Your positives and negatives are extremely important as you move through this. And they have been as we've used the quadratic formula in general. Remember, I'm putting my B in parentheses because if it's positive or negative, I'm squaring it. So negative 10 squared is positive 100. Negative 4 times 4 is negative 16. Negative 16 times 10 is a negative 160. So I'm going to combine that. 100 minus 160 is a negative 60. So I'm going to come back up here. I have a negative number. So there are 2 imaginary solutions, which means my final answer is going to have I in it. Okay, your final answer is going to have I in it. When it comes to imaginary solutions, and using the quadratic formula or really any way to solve, there's really only going to be, hold on, let me think. So the only thing you're not going to be able to do is factor. So you cannot factor a problem that has imaginary solutions. You can take square roots. You can complete the square. and you can use the quadratic formula. So for the next couple days, know that all of your answers are going to have imaginary solutions. Come Friday, I'm going to mix them all together, and you're just going to have to work them out and see what happens, okay? You're still going to use your same chart. So let me flip back to that chart so we remember. You're going to use your same chart from Monday that we created, right, with the 4 different types. Again, the only one you cannot do is factoring when it comes to imaginary solutions, but all the other ones are a possibility, and you should use the same criteria to get you there, okay? So let's just go back to choose a method. And solve. Choose a method and solve. And you're going to practice this for a couple days, but again, if you understand how to choose a method, then you're going to be good to go. So let's look at, how about 4x squared plus 11 equals 6. 4x squared plus 11 equals 6. So if you take a look at that problem, and you think about all the methods, and remember, because we're dealing with complex numbers now, or imaginary numbers, we're not going to factor. So take that off the table. You don't get to use that one today. Okay, so you have taking square roots, you have completing the square, and you have the quadratic formula. If you look at that particular problem, which one of those 3 stands out to you? I hope that you said taking square roots. And the reason taking square root should stand out to you is there's no bx term. Okay, we don't have that bx term, so it's easier to take square roots. Could I use the quadratic formula? Absolutely. Remember, the quadratic formula is always going to work, even in this case as well. But taking square roots is easier, so that's what I'm going to do. I want to get x squared by itself, so I'm going to subtract 11 from both sides, giving me 4x squared equals negative 5. If I keep going, I'm going to divide by 4. X squared equals negative 5/4. And we're going to take the square root. Now, just like before, x equals plus or minus. So the square root of negative 5, for right now I'm going to just keep negative 5, and we'll talk about it in a second, and the square root of 4 is 2. The big thing that you need to remember, and you can do this in the step above without having to write it twice, is you cannot keep a negative underneath the square root. So if you remember from the beginning of the semester, this is the same as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 5 all over 2. The square root of negative 1 is I, so it's plus or minus I, because the plus or minus is still up front, so the I comes after it. The square root of 5 doesn't change, all over 2. So some of you will be able to go from taking the square root here to this step, and that's absolutely fine, but I wanted you to see where it came from. Okay, so today and tomorrow for sure, you're going to see problems where all of your answers will have a negative underneath the square root, which means all of your answers will have I in your final answer. When it comes to Friday, they're all going to be mixed. So some will have real solutions, some will have imaginary solutions. Let's look at one more, and then I'm going to let you work. So let's look at 3x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. I would like you to take a second with your group and decide which method you're going to use. So which one is going to be the easiest to use? So I know I can eliminate factoring because I know right now from my notes that they're going to be imaginary solutions, and I cannot factor with imaginary solutions. I know I can eliminate taking square roots because I have a b term, which leaves me with quadratic formula or completing the square. Now when I look at this problem, I know that this, in order to complete the square, this has to be a 1. And if I divide through by 3, I'm going to get fractions. And we probably don't want to deal with fractions, which means our option then is quadratic formula. Okay, so that's how you're going to kind of process through and do that elimination. And it's important that you can take those steps and process through. So I'm going to identify A, B, and C. So A is 3, B is 2, C is 1. And I'm going to plug it into the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, nothing changes about it, but as we simplify, your answer, because of the notes today, should be a negative underneath. So x equals negative 2 plus or minus, let me adjust this real quick, plus or minus the square root, 2 squared is 4, and then I have negative 4 times 3 is negative 12, negative 12 times 1 is negative 12, all over 6. I'm going to keep going. So x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root, or minus 12 is a negative 8 over 6. X equals negative 2 plus or minus. Now I know 8 can break down to 4 times 2 and 2 times 2. So you have a pair of 2's that come out. You have this negative that becomes an I, and you have that 2 left over. Okay, so you have a pair of 2's that come out, that negative becomes an I, and you have a 2 left over. All over 6. Just like when we were simplifying before, it has to divide into all 3 of these outside numbers. So whatever number you're going to simplify has to go into all 3 outside numbers for you to be able to do it. So is there a number that goes into negative 2, 2, and 6? Your answer should be 2. So 2 goes into itself once, and 3 times. You cannot, I repeat, you cannot divide it here because that's underneath the square root. So final answer is x equals negative 1 plus or minus. You can write the 1 if you want. I'm just going to write I square root of 2 all over 3. So the process is the same. The difference is your answer for today and tomorrow only will have I every single time. One more time on Friday, I'm going to mix up what we did on Monday and Tuesday and what you're doing today and tomorrow on Friday, and you'll just have to practice that solving. Okay? So the biggest thing with all of this is making sure that you use this chart as you go through. Go back to my chart. Making sure you use this chart to help you identify key features to solve each of the problems. Okay? If you have no idea which one you could possibly use and you're getting frustrated, your option should be the quadratic formula because it always works. No matter how you are solving, what your solutions are, quadratic formula will always work. Make that your option if you have absolutely no idea what else to do. Okay, so you're going to spend the rest of the period working on homework. Take your time, ask questions, but I think you are all capable of doing it. You just have to use your brains a little bit.